And the last of the symphonies we're going to take a look at is the last symphony Beethoven wrote in his lifetime. And a lot of people consider this one to be one of the greatest pieces of works of all time. In my personal opinion, if somebody were to say you could only show an alien one piece of music, this is probably the one I'd show them. Beethoven's Ninth Symphony, nicknamed the Choral Symphony, really because of this part we're going to take a listen to here, which is, of course, the very end of the fourth movement, the final movement of the piece. The whole piece is great. In the fourth movement, we hear the Ode to Joy theme, which was based on a writing by Schiller, but Beethoven put it to words and added it to a symphony orchestra, which is a big deal because most of the time we just have string and wind instruments, a little bit of percussion instruments, but now we have an entire choir that goes with it. In order to perform the Ninth Symphony, as it's meant to be performed, requires over 100 musical performers. The Ninth Symphony was so influential that after Beethoven had passed away and his music was being used, like we mentioned earlier, by a lot of these symphony orchestras to sell tickets. People loved to come see this music. And because Beethoven was becoming a legend after his lifetime, a lot of other composers who were still in classical music, which was the popular music of the time, we have to understand. Many composers were afraid to write any more 9 symphonies because Beethoven only wrote 9 symphonies. Beethoven's life would come to an end on March 26th of 1827, which is why we're talking about it today, because it's pretty close to today's date. Beethoven, of course, did have a lot of success within his own life, but he was never quite a truly rich man. When we look at how much his music's been performed in the nearly 200 years since he's died, it's really quite remarkable of the staying power that his music has had and how people hundreds of years after his own lifetime are still familiar with who he is around the world, more so than even in his own lifetime. People only around Europe kind of knew who he was back then. Now, most of the world knows who Beethoven is. I know we talked a little bit about this music today, but I don't want to describe it too much. You know, the great film director Stanley Kubrick may have said it best when he was talking about the music of Beethoven. He was quoted as saying, "To explain a Beethoven symphony would be to emasculate it by erecting an artificial barrier between conception and appreciation." Interesting to think about. To sit back and listen to it is really the experience that Beethoven wanted you to have. It's not so much about talking about it so much. Having context, knowing the background and history of it definitely helps to give you an idea of what you were listening to. But really with classical music, it's one of those things you just got to sit back and appreciate. One last note about the type of person that Beethoven was. You know, he was very involved. He was very passionate. He would have a lot of temper tantrums and get really fits of rage from time to time. When it came to his Ninth Symphony, it was something that he put so much time and effort into, and he knew it was going to be something special and quite remarkable. So he wanted to conduct the orchestra. But the concert hall that was going to be paying the musicians to be playing the music and, of course, selling tickets to an audience wanted to make sure that this wasn't going to be a gigantic mess. So they actually hired a secondary conductor to conduct the orchestra, which is an important role. As you may have seen in some of these videos, they hold all these musicians together, especially with the Ninth Symphony, over 100 people. You need someone that kind of keep everybody together. Beethoven would stand on the stage and conduct the symphony, but apparently it ended and he was still going. He couldn't hear the music. And the story goes that one of the vocalists from the choir came down and turned Beethoven around so he could see the audience because he was still conducting. And the audience, the applause were going wild. The audience absolutely loved it, as people still do to this day. And that was really a lifelong accomplishment for Beethoven himself. When Beethoven got to his late 20s, somewhere around the age of 27, he started having a ringing in his ear. And as the years progressed, he started to lose sensitivity to hearing high-pitched sounds, and it got worse. He was going deaf. We can kind of hear this in some of Beethoven's music as he gets into his 30s, because he starts to write it a lot more for lower pitch sounds, getting a little bit less use of higher pitch noises because he couldn't necessarily hear them as well. He wanted to be able to play music that he could feel the vibrations of. If you've ever been around low frequencies at loud sounds, you know that they kind of give a rumble, whereas high pitched sounds, you don't really feel it as much as low sounds. So Beethoven was writing a lot more in these more bass ranges. We see that even in his Third Symphony, the Eroica, where the big bass is bum, 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 bum. And of course, we get on to the Fifth Symphony, bum, 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 bum. Really low sounds, very much kind of make the stage that you would be standing on vibrate. So Beethoven was really focusing in on making sure that he could still hear what he could. But as he got later into his 30s and into his 40s, his hearing was really starting to go. I mean, he really couldn't hear much of anything. Beethoven, of course, tried to find ways to stop his hearing loss, go to different doctors, and they came up with all sorts of crazy ideas. You have to understand, medicine, doctors, they did not have the same knowledge we have today. They didn't have the same surgeries and medicine they could give us. So they had some very weird suggestions they told him. One doctor even suggested to strap wet bark to his arms and let it dry out over a course of a couple of days. Now, of course, this would cause blisters and didn't really do anything for his hearing, but some doctors thought that might actually help his hearing. Beethoven also would use what they would call kind of like hearing trumpets, which were they look like the end of a trumpet, and you hold it up to his ear, and people would literally talk into it, and it would be like a bit of a microphone in some sort of way, so it would help amplify the sound. But as time went on, it was just difficult for Beethoven to hear anything. The story that goes when he was hanging out with one of his good friends, Ferdinand Ries, they were taking a walk through the countryside, and someone was playing some music, and Ferdinand's face looked to the music, and obviously being a music lover, he had an expression on his face. Beethoven looked at his friend, saw that expression, but he couldn't hear the music. And at this point, he realized he was really deaf, because his friend could enjoy music nearby and he couldn't even hear it. This really threw Beethoven into a deep depression, and Beethoven became a bit of a recluse for a few years, kind of went away. But he contemplated, was it worth maybe giving up everything or continuing onward? And Beethoven had such a deep musical knowledge. You have to understand that for the first 25 years of his life, 26 years of his life, he had no problem with his hearing. And he really was so well attuned with what he was writing. He could hear it in his head, mostly in his imagination. So when we listen to some of the later works of Beethoven's life, just consider that he never actually heard these. They were all in his imagination. And it's interesting to consider, did they really come out sounding the way he intended them to? When you listen to things like that Ninth Symphony, that final symphony he wrote, it's hard to assume that was all just luck that it came out sounding the way it did. He was a master of music, and really shows that in the fact that he wrote some of the greatest pieces of music of all time, most celebrated, according to the people who program music and sell tickets to the people who choose to go. Some of the greatest music of all time while he was deaf. Very interesting thing to consider. Now, so what caused the deafness? It's really hard to say. This was happening in the late 1700s, early 1800s. So it's really difficult for us to today have any idea exactly what caused his deafness. Some people say that there was a lot of disease that went around, which was quite likely. And some less believable but very interesting theories include Beethoven used to stay up very late nights writing music. And when he would get tired, some say that he used to dip his head into a bucket of cold water. And the cold water getting into his ears constantly may have caused it. Not likely. And another story goes, Beethoven himself even got so mad at a musical rehearsal one time that he went into a fit of rage and he fell over. And he said that when he came to, that he couldn't hear as well. And sometimes he thinks that maybe his hearing loss came from that. So if anything we could take away from that, don't dip your head in buckets of cold water, and also don't have a temper tantrum. It's not good for you. Maybe you'll go deaf. Who knows? But there you go. Well, anyways, guys, I really hope you've enjoyed this. Beethoven, one of the most recognizable names in all of music, yet a lot of us don't really listen to him as much. So hopefully you guys give him a chance. In my opinion, Beethoven is worthy of the fame that he's gotten over the past 200 years. And I really hope you guys get the chance to, at some point in time, listen to his music, or even better yet, when the world allows it, go see a symphony orchestra or a pianist or a string quartet perform some of his music. It's really beautiful, and it's a great way to get in touch with the history of what music has to offer. So I hope you guys have enjoyed this. We're talking about another key figure in music next week, so we'll talk about that when we get there. Have a good one, guys. Peace.